welcome to the first Sean Trace show and the inaugural. I am super excited to introduce my lovely and amazing guest. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Sean, and congratulations on your new show. And
Thank you so much.
I'm very honored to be your first guest. What a thrill. My name, I guess I should tell you, is Jill Massie, and that's who I am. Let me know if you want to know anything else.
I would love to know more, Jill. Now, Jill, what do you do? This is going to be a show about creativity and in general, and especially looking at film and music and things like that. Now, you have a really interesting background. Can you tell me a little bit about what you do and then maybe how you got to that space?
Sure. Most of my days in 2021 and the previous few years, I am working with clients mostly on dialect. I'm a dialect coach. That's one of the hats I wear. And right now, the most common hat I wear. And I work with clients thanks to wonderful technology from all over the world. So my day is often spent with actors who are from anywhere from Asia, a lot of them in Europe and all over the United States, working on different accents, often American accents, for auditions or roles that they've been cast in.
Interesting. And what does a typical session with you look like?
Well, it depends on if the client is working on a specific piece. If, for instance, if they have an audition or they've been cast, we work a little bit differently than those who are trying to learn an accent to master it or have an audition coming up, etc. We focus a little bit more holistically when I'm teaching the accent. When we're on an audition, we'll cut to shortcuts. I'll use a lot of shortcuts because there's no time for really deep learning. It's just you've got to be able to pass the test. So
interesting.
Yeah. So it depends.
It depends. So some two different kind of categories: people that are focused in on an audition, and people that are more just trying to learn an accent. Now, the U.S. has a lot of different accents. Like, what do you normally teach?
Well, that's a good question. And most of the time, I'm working with actors outside the U.S., and I'm teaching them a modern general American accent. However, with American actors and those who are auditioning for roles other than just the general American, the most common one I get are various Southern accents. Those are the ones that tend to show up in film and television the most. And then I would say second to that would be New York accents.
Interesting.
As far as American accents go.
Yeah, those are definitely special. I remember once that I was taking an acting class in Santa Monica, and there was an actress there that was she had come from Australia, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm Australian, and I've been working on my American accent." And I was like, "Oh, I'd love to hear it." And then she jumped into this American accent. One of the things that was really interesting was that the accent was American, but it wasn't consistent. Like, some words were, she was doing one word would be like from it sounded like upper class New Yorker, and then the next word sounded like something that was from Chicago, and the next word was from Boston, and then California. How do you work with people who don't have that frame of reference to kind of get a consistent accent?
That's a really good question. So most of the time, to start out with, and most American auditions are for a modern general American accent. And that modern general American accent now has moved more toward Western states. That is where we're kind of pulling our general, because of film and television. It has spread around the world, so that's what people hear. So we work if there's time, it all depends on time. But let's say somebody's just learning the accent just to have it in their cache of skills that they can bring to the table. We learn originally all of the vowel sounds, specifically the vowel sounds of the accent, and let's say we're saying General American, and in English there are 44, depending on your school of thought, individual sounds that make up the language, and there's only 26 letters. So that there's a little bit of an issue there. So for people who, especially if it's not their first language, we have to get really deep into the nitty-gritty of all of those individual sounds, because if you don't put those together right, and if you're not following that specific accent, it's going to sound exactly like you talked about. It'll sound somewhat American, and Americans do this same thing with British accents. You'll hear British people just kind of laugh at the mishmash that we have, right, when we're doing British accents.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think that people don't just think about it. It's not just the basic sounds. It's also how we put them together. I remember I taught English for a long time, and I'm not a dialect coach, but I've taught English overseas for a long time to internet and in the States too. That was one of the many hats that I have worn in my life.
That's great.
But it was one of the interesting things is that different countries had really different ways of structuring the sound of a sentence. You get someone from a country like Japan, and the tones are much more flat versus, where I live in Vietnam right now, the tones are rising and falling in the way that words are grouped. And what are some other things that people generally run into? What are some challenges that people might run into when they approach dialect coaching?
Okay. I'll tell you one that is universal, and this is even if you have this accent naturally or you've mastered it. It's pulling the written word off the page and turning it into real speech. What happens is, especially if somebody has a different second language, learning the accent is one thing, and it poses its own challenges. But if your first language is very different and structured very differently, what inflection, tone, word stress, especially, I find that people a lot of times. Generally in English, you stress the nouns and the verbs, and occasionally an adjective or an adverb. That's pretty much the way we work. And that Shakespeare had it right with the iambic pentameter. We tend to talk da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da with, and then with stressed things. That's very, that's not apparent when it's black and white flat on a page. So people often will stress words that don't feel right. A native listener is going to know something's wrong, might not know what it is, but it doesn't feel right. And I will tell you,
it sounds wrong.
Yeah, it sounds wrong. And I tell you what, I hear this almost as much, or at least a good percentage of time with American actors. When they pull that line off the page,
You're from
not
LA.
natural. Not from LA, but I lived in LA.
You lived in LA.
Yeah, for a fairly long time.
Did you ever remember hearing about them doing Point Break live?
No.
There was a long time. There was a team that did Point Break live, and I love Keanu Reeves. But one of the jokes was that in the Point Break live, the actors would play all the characters except for Keanu. Oh. And what they did is that they would pick the Keanu character from the audience, and then they would have him read cue cards. And so
I'm so sorry I missed this.
Right? I never got to see it. I never got to see Point Break live, but my friends, bunch of my friends went and they loved it. But one of the things that I always would notice with people that are, whether you give someone a script, and especially teaching international speakers, what you would get, we talk about robot English, and it's just like, I've noticed actors doing the same thing from a script, even native speakers.
I know. I know.
How would you tell someone to approach, what advice would you give an actor, even a native speaker, to work on that or work around that?
I do different things. It depends on the person, because you've got to kind of find what can shake up their rhythms a little bit, if that makes sense. People get really locked into rhythms. But a lot of times I will ask them, okay, so tell me this same thing, but this is what I want, me as my character. My character has just told you this, and I give them a different cue line, or and sometimes I will tell them what to decide what they're hoping to achieve by saying that statement. And sometimes that's enough to shake it up. And then sometimes, to be frank, I will just be very, rudimentary. No, you really need to stress the verb here, right? And then all of a sudden they'll do that, and it's like a revelation to people. Because so many times people don't think about things that way. And we're taught to read in this country very mechanically in school. Yeah. So there you go.
Well, and I remember you'd worked with me. My dad is English, and I grew up with a British accent, around British accents. My father lost his accent because they moved out of England when he was so young. But, my grandparents and my uncle still maintain some of their accents. But one of the things that was interesting is when you were practicing with me, working on an RP accent, and you had me switch the intonation that I was saying something down, and you had me switch it up. And it because I like that you talk about the rhythms, because you look at anyone, whether it be a Johnny Depp or look at Christopher Walken or William Shatner, they have a cadence.
They do. That
is something that becomes ingrained in them, that is hard to break, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And if it works for you as far as casting goes, it can be a boon. I'd say for 95% of us, it's not. It can be, a trademark, like you said. So if you get kind of in that cadence and you become famous for that particular style, then that can be really helpful. Unless you decide to break out of it, then sometimes that can cause confusion. But for most of us, the goal is to play a character as truthfully as possible. So you want to, I think, actors want to sound like real conversation in a real setting, in that real way. I was very fortunate in my early training, like this is going back to 1902 or something like that. But no, back in my early training in the 80s in LA, one of the things that a group of classes that I took was at this, and it's long gone now, but it was at this studio called West Baron Hill. And their focus was on commercial acting, spokesperson material, and then they also did on-camera stuff, which was kind of new at the time, to be able to work with cameras in the studio back in the 80s. Yeah. But it was such a big deal. But having that training early on, I can't thank them enough for this focusing on really down to the nitty-gritty of inflection, which word distress, when to go up at the end of a sentence, when to go down at the end of a sentence. And I had some of that in college as well, in a more formal way, but something about putting that on commercial copy. Because you're selling, you always have one objective with a commercial, and that's to sell the product, right? So your objective is stated ultimately, your overall objective. So learning that it gets boring if you tend to go down at every sentence, and it's not the way people really talk most of the time. That something about that really registered with me, and that's where my interest in this whole mechanics of speech and the way people talk really started from that, those commercial classes at a little acting studio in the Valley.
It's really interesting because you tagged on something. My wife is a celebrity here in Vietnam, and she's cool. She's a super cool person, right? But one of the things that's really interesting in Vietnam that's very different from the West is that all of the singers that I know here, all the performers, have a stage presence, and they have a stage voice, and so it's and it's much more showmanship. It's much more like, you remember, maybe you don't remember, but I can reference, there are old movies from the 40s and 50s, and like the people, well, goody, and it's just there was this showmanship language that kind of popped in,
right?
And it wasn't necessarily real, but it was, what was the name of that movie? There was a great movie. Hey, was it Hail Caesar? That was the Coen brothers.
Oh yeah,
with George Clooney.
Oh well, if that's I don't know if that's the name of it, but yes, I know the one you're talking about. What was it called?
I think
I loved it. Maybe that was the name of it.
I think it was Hail Caesar, but
it might have been. It might have been. I loved it. I love all of their work. Yeah.
It was amazing. But there was one scene that was, they were describing this young actor. It was like this studio executive's office. And we are actors, but yet for people that are casting, an actor is not just a commodity, but they are a package. Mm-hmm. And there was this approach that was talked about these actors, that they were, there was like this guy, he's good with, and it was his very 1950s, you know what I mean? He's like, he can ride a horse really well. Yeah. His tap dancing's phenomenal, and it was just like they went through this checklist that was really interesting. The skill set. Yeah. And but yet this one character, I believe, I might be wrong, but there was something about the way he spoke, because I think he was like a Southern, it was like kind of like a cowboy, and he had this twang to him, and so there was a limitation in his career. Yep. And it's really interesting now that we are looking at, I've tended to notice something that in film, and I want to ask your opinion on this, because I have mine. I tend to notice two schools of thought in acting, and one school of thought would be your actors that are phenomenal actors. I'm thinking like Tom Hanks, right? Denzel Washington, even Dwayne Johnson. I actually like Dwayne Johnson. I do too. But they are them. Mm-hmm. When Tom Hanks comes into a role, he's amazing, but he's amazingly Tom Hanks, and he brings that Tom Hanksness to that role. Mm-hmm. School of thought A, right? School of thought B are your Daniel Day-Lewis, your Gary Oldman, your Tom Hardy, that I didn't know that for the longest time. I didn't know Daniel Day-Lewis was English, and suddenly I heard his real voice, and I was like, whoa. Right. It caught me off guard, especially after Gangs of New York. Yes. And these two different schools of thoughts, these people that are themselves in every movie, which is not a problem, and then these people that become this character. Right. Where do you stand on this spectrum? Oh, that it's almost a kind of a slightly hot button issue in the world of acting, isn't it? Especially on camera. It is. It's a little bit touchy. I want to say the reason I ask, because you work with dialects, is the reason, and one of my movies and performances that I absolutely am insanely enamored with would be Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood. Oh. And one of the reasons is, if I grew, my grandpa was an Angeleno, and he grew up, and he was a USC grad in the 1940s, 30s maybe. And, his family then had immigrated to LA from Arizona. And they had this accent that it was the old California, Arizona accent. And Daniel Day-Lewis nails it. He does. And There Will Be Blood. He does. And I was like, whoa, that's amazing. Yeah. And so like that's where my passion is at. I think that's amazing. I'm not skilled like that, but it's really interesting. So what is your take on the two different approaches, and how would you work with an actor who was in each school, maybe I should say? So
that's a really interesting secondary question. First of all, I understand because the camera is such a different experience. Working in front of the camera is such a different experience than working on the stage. So I understand how, and this is how the movie star arose. The movie star was basically a star because they played that character over and over and over in a different setting. And
like Buster Keaton.
Yeah, exactly. And just all of the movie stars back then, all of that was the whole appeal for people, because they wanted to see essentially that same character in a new situation and how they come through it. And they, there's something familiar about seeing another John Wayne movie, because you're gonna pretty much what you're gonna get. Now they can, the situations can change a little bit, the character will change slightly, but you're still gonna see, reliably John Wayne every time you do that. Back in the day, that's sort of how that whole thing arose. It's not what happened in the theater before that came to be. So except maybe on vaudeville, there was some acts that would kind of have that recurring kind of character, etc. So, and I personally, in my training, in my earliest acting training, which would have been in my undergraduate college acting training, and then classes that I took therefor, and my goal was to become somebody else. That's kind of what I always thought the job was, and that was the appeal for me, to be that person in the story, because I was an avid reader as a kid, and I wanted to be that person for a little bit. So that's where I come down.
I'm gonna jump in. I love it too, because I'm not a Jedi. But my dream would be to play a Jedi. You know what I mean? It's like to wear someone else's shoes
for a little bit.
For a little bit is fun.
It's so much fun when you really feel like you've kind of disappeared into this character. So, and that's what, and I love to watch that too. I'm enamored by actors that can do that. So if I had to pick, especially for my own work, I'm an actor. Let's find a character and build that character from the bottom up, one step at a time. That's my joy.
And I'm looking forward to what people don't know, but hopefully people will know, is that you and I are working on a fun web series right now. And I absolutely love the character of Estelle. It's one of my favorites.
I love Estelle. We all know Estelle, right? We all know her. Yeah.
And so let's imagine that you have someone coming to you who is looking for let's imagine that there's an actor who has this big chance, this big casting chance, and they're coming to you. How would you normally approach? Let's go, and this is not the person who is looking for long-term. This is not the slow build. This is a person who's got this casting session, this self-tape, and they're up for an audition. Like, how would you approach a person like that? What would it look like?
It kind of depends on, of one thing, time.
Accents, time.
So, yes. So if you have something to do other than just, coach them in their normal themselves, in this, they don't have to add on any particular physical things or a different voice or a different. When I had an acting studio for several years, and I worked in another acting studio for several years, and so I've taught a lot of different kinds of acting classes. So with different approaches and different theories. But one of the things that I feel like is, going back to the basic of knowing what you want as a character. That's always included. And then I'm a real believer in, just taking time to, it's a little bit too academic to write a biography of the character. Now, it's good for class, but it's not realistic for real life. But I do think you want to add some particulars, some things that make this character unique. And, especially if you're doing an audition, because you want your audition to stand out, right?
And I'm going to poke at something right now, too, because accent work and your voice coaching that you're doing is not just voice coaching. It's not just accent reduction training. It really is, to me, seemingly like you are also doing acting training. Am I wrong there?
You can't really separate the two. I mean, if you go to, you to a certain degree, you can. If let's say I'm coaching a business professional, then I'm focused strictly on speech and communication. But I also don't have to be so exacting with them, because they're just trying to communicate and be understood by other people. For an actor, you have to be really, really specific. But yeah, it goes hand in hand. They're interwoven. If you go to a drama school in, say, the UK or in Canada, or, just anywhere there's a drama school, most of the time the teachers work, they're intertwined. They know what's going on in every other class, and they weave that all in together. The voice teachers are also acting teachers, and the acting teachers also have good voice training, and it all sort of, and physical movement. That's the other thing that tends to come in there, and it all kind of, so it's hard to pull it apart.
One of my favorite teachers is based out of LA, and I met him on a movie that I was working on. And he teaches the Alexander technique.
It's wonderful.
And it was it was just really mind-blowing to see how even just posture and breath were so important to an actor's ability to perform and to share this. It was very interesting like that.
I had one of my college professors. I was in college when Ordinary People came out with Donald Sutherland and Mary Tyler Moore, and I forget the young man's name, but his father was also an actor. But anyway, one of our assignments was to watch Donald Sutherland breathe. We had it in that movie, and it was a revelation to me. Using the breath in the character and in the scene as a tool was fascinating.
I'm a huge fan of Japanese cinema, specifically the works of Akira Kurosawa, and specifically of the actor Toshiro Mifune, and or in Japan it'd be Mifune Toshiro. And one of the things that was always so special about him is that in his very intense mannerisms, and so like in Seven Samurai, he's got this shoulder roll that is just this thing he does, but yet there was this, and this is something that I feel has been lost to a degree in television and film, is that there was, because a lot of these people came from theater, and theater is movement based, and that's something that's really interesting when I came to Vietnam, because when I moved here 20 years ago, the film industry was building still. It was not as established. They didn't have a long history of film, but they had a long history of theater that was connected to their traditional theater, but also the French influence. And so when I went to a comedy show, their acting and their stuff was big. It was always big. There were movements and someone coming up with like a someone's gonna hit someone with a sandal or something, and it was just these big movements. And now one of the things, I got to work with Tom Hanks on a set, and one of the things that was amazing with Tom is that my friend was like, just watch Tom in the scene, because there'd be a person standing here, and Tom was just an excellent at sliding for the camera. He knew what the cameras were, where the cameras were, but he also knew which lens was being used, and he would come up, and I would watch him. He'd be like, "What guys are you shooting on now? You know, what lens are you shooting on?" And so he knew, is it a wide, is it tight? And yet, because of these things, I feel like there are not a lot of actors that get into the physicality of the role.
I understand.
Except in the newest Loki TV show where Jonathan Majors is.
I haven't seen.
Absolutely. Oh, you have to check it out.
Oh, I will.
He's absolutely fit. His physicality is amazing.
Oh, fabulous.
But go ahead. I want. What is your take on?
No,
on the physicality?
you know, because the camera is so internal, it's capturing what's inside you through your eyes and what you're thinking and what, you know. So because there's such a focus on that inside thing, and there's there are a lot of there's a lot of training about keeping your physicality subtle so that it doesn't pull from the story. You know, if you have, let's say you have something that you do with your face that is like a habit, that's one of the things that, you know, the director or your teacher or your casting director will say, you got to get rid of that. You can't do that. You can't lick your lips. You can't, you know, whatever. And because it's distracting and it's, the camera makes everything so much bigger. Whereas on stage, you have to physically make it bigger so that the people in the back row can see. On camera, it's just the opposite. You've got to pull it in, pull it in, pull it in, pull it in. On the downside of that, you're right. We have lost a lot of the physical training for actors on camera that helps them be. If you look at the old, you know, you watch some of my husband and I have been watching old films of late. We're in this tear. We're watching things from the 30s and watching a lot of old films. And you watch the physicality of those actors and the grace with which they move from one place to the other. You can tell that they started out with theater training because they move with such purpose. They understand that movement is such a very important part of acting. Now, there are actors that still do that are just camera actors, but it's not as focused on.
You hit on a couple interesting things there, because one is that traditionally everything and still I feel like, you know, if we are in an industry that is redefining itself post COVID-19. Definitely. And it's very interesting because especially in the training aspects, traditionally, you know, if you go back to Stanislavski, Strasberg, this was theater based. It is very much the core of the training was theater. And yet now, and there was a major reluctance of teachers to do any type of distance work or online, and there weren't necessarily the not the skills, but the tools to do so. Right. But now there is this, you know, especially because of COVID-19, all of the major schools have had to go online, and it's kind of created a really interesting new dynamic. How do you feel about everything going online?
Oh, well, this is one time in my life that I was ahead of the curve. Because when I lived in Los Angeles, I was out in the outskirts of Los Angeles. And if you know anything about LA traffic, it's insane.
Oh, I do.
So I started, because most of my clients were closer in, they were in Hollywood or in the Valley, etc. And I was further out. And so I started probably 10 or 11 years ago working on Skype with my clients. Now, this is interesting. I had some pushback from some, and I would also go into LA twice a week and drive from person to person house, which was just exhausting, expensive.
It's exhausting.
You know, but because I had some people that just insisted that they couldn't do it unless I was face to face with them. That after it took a couple of years of trying to kind of negotiate that back, because I just realized I can't do this. I waste so much time traveling from person to person. So I pretty much built up and then I started working with people internationally, and it was like, wow, all of a sudden. I remember the days, there was a client I had in Canada, this is back in the 90s. I literally had to record a cassette tape, send it to him through the mail. He had to listen. He had to call. It was just, it was so hard. And honestly, it is also kind of, anyway, so I was a little bit ahead of the curve. I've been doing this for a long time, and I really believe in it for voice work. And it's becoming more and more accessible for acting work. We've got to figure this out a little bit more as far as people being in the same room and working on scenes together and all of that. That's still challenging, but I think we can find ways to make it happen. But I forget what I was going to say. Something about teaching teaching a class online. But nevertheless, I think we have to do it. We have to find ways to do it, because this kind of thing could be happening for a while.
In the industry, from what I've been hearing, people, callbacks, self-tapes, it's becoming a digital world, and especially for a studio, if they can get people on Zoom instead of flying people back out for different callbacks and such, it's a cost cutting thing.
It's cost and time and everything. Yeah, in fact, and this is not that I was very prescient, but I predicted this like 6 years ago, when people first started getting those occasional video auditions, and they would complain. And I would say, get used to it, because this is not going to change. When people realize how much time and money they're saving, this is going to be, especially for the first audition, because I used to be a casting director, and going through all of those initial ones when a good, hello, Lily. The cat just decided to join. When
it makes it much more interesting.
Yeah, she's a star. She just wanted to steal some of that limelight. But that you're a good 85% of these people are not going to get called back. But you have to watch. So it's a no-brainer. It's a no-brainer, don't you think?
No. And this is what I think is really interesting about. I had a conversation with another one of our mutual friends, and about how being on camera is so beneficial, because you're doing these classes online and you're getting used to just being on camera.
That's true.
And it's really interesting how many actors do acting, but they still aren't comfortable with a camera.
Right.
And so it's a really interesting thing to me that this is, it used to be, I remember some of those early on camera, acting classes, and it's like you
have to
didn't
get comfortable with seeing yourself, for one thing, and really get comfortable with all of your, good and bad, all of the stuff that you have. Also,
your movements, your posture,
all of that. All of that, and all the little extra, things that you have that you do, and also it allows you to start discovering what works for you best, what angles work for you best, what mannerisms, what hand is better
I'm looking
for you.
At myself in the camera,
Exactly.
Where is my best angle?
Exactly. So just getting used to and comfortable with this thing being on you is a huge benefit. So instead of looking at the downside, there are downsides to Zoom classes. Of course, you're not there with, but think of the positives. We're all getting much more camera savvy.
I agree.
Yeah.
And here's one question for you. Like, in you at your heart, because when I asked you the other day, like, what is your profession? And I love that your answer to me is, first and foremost, you're an actor. and at your core, at your heart, you do these other things for work, but you're an actor. So what does that mean to you?
Well, it's something, honestly, that I've known since I was a child, that's who I am. I've just known it. I didn't know, growing up in small town Ohio, I didn't know what that meant and how that manifested itself at that point. But I tried to find ways to make it happen, and I would bring my friends together reluctantly. I was all up for it, but they would sometimes, oh, Jill's doing it again, and create situations where I could be an actor. And it's like, if they got to be one too, that's great. But it was about me being an actor, right? So I've just always done that, and that's what my training was, and that's and teaching came as a result of that. And then I found my other calling, and that is as a teacher. I'm a teacher. I like to teach actors. I like to teach pretty much everybody, but I like to facilitate other people to do the thing that I love as well. And so I wear both hats, but at my core, it's always about the acting, because that's what I was trained, and that's how I identify.
Is there anything that you wish you could have done differently in your career?
We have 3 hours. Oh gosh, I've the ones that get away. We all have those stories, right? But the teaching started in a real way when I had children. And this happens to women especially. It's exceedingly common. I was in my early 30s, had my first child. I couldn't do, because I was doing mostly theater at that time. I couldn't do a tour. I just couldn't. Yeah. That just wasn't going to be the way of it. And you're gone every night. And I also had a husband that I wanted to maintain a relationship with. So and he was a musician on the road. So we both had to kind of figure out how to navigate the new thing. So, and then eventually what happened, I had a wonderful mentor, a brilliant mentor who I had trained with as an actor in my early years. She brought me in, basically apprenticing her, and had me teaching at her studio. She was a very renowned teacher, and I was so lucky.
That's so awesome.
So I'm not complaining, I guess is what I'm saying. Yes, I do wish I could have done, there's some roles that I really wish I could have done when I was primed for those roles. At the same time, teaching gives me a lot of joy.
Well, I think there's one thing that I'm excited about, the fact that we are working together on our project. And one of the things that I feel like, even when I started into acting 15 years ago, more seriously when I was in LA, one of the things that was exceedingly difficult was, and this is something that I think we're seeing an absolute revolution in the music and film industry, because of the decentralization of the creation process.
Exactly.
And, especially for music, it used to be that, my wife and I were having a conversation the other day about, like this singer, and she was like, where did she go? Because she was so talented. Well, they didn't want to produce more of her albums. It wasn't anything about her. I'm sure she wanted to keep going. It was that the people, the powers that be, said that, we're just not going to work with this person anymore. Yeah. And to me now, with the film industry, there's a revolution happening as well. And that, the idea that anyone with a camera, because it used to be the cameras, to get something that was cinema quality, it was prohibitively expensive.
I'm envious of young people right now, how they can
crazy.
Just make. It's amazing.
And well, that's what I'm excited about, because now you for $1,000 you can get a camera that can do everything, and the editing is simple.
Amazing.
I think that the idea that people can take control of their careers is really empowering right now.
And it allows artists to be their best selves. If you have the tools to create without the limitations of the man deciding if it's commercial enough or if it will fit in their, their genres that they need.
And also who you should play.
Yes, exactly. So that's true for actors as well as creators. So yeah, you're absolutely, and it's I do think there will be, and it's already started a revolution on what's going to happen with every kind of thing that's on camera, from film to podcast to just everything.
And with as well as with the shift from, I know there was already a shift away from theaters towards streaming, but COVID-19 absolutely expedited that.
Yes.
There's a lot of content that people are looking to share.
Yep.
And I'm not talking the creators, I'm talking companies need content.
Yes, that's true. And, it's true. Content. If you have any inclination to write, now is the time.
A great time.
Go for
it's
it.
It's a great time.
Yeah.
I wanted to read a quote to you today that I saw from an actor, and I wanted to get your perspective. Brennan Close said this: "With acting, there is no blueprint. Whatever your journey to it is going to be different from other people's." What do you think of that quote, and
well,
what do you think of?
It depends on what he's referring to as acting. If he's talking about technique, maybe, but as far as but as far as what brings you to the profession and what your journey is as an actor, I completely understand that. It's if you talk to 10 actors, you're going to have 10 different stories, maybe with some things in common, but if you talk to people about how they got there, it's amazing how varied those stories are. So if that's what he's talking about, then I completely get it.
Yeah. Now, what advice? Imagine that young Jill is standing in front of you.
Oh.
What advice? Imagine that she is a young actor trying to make it in this modern industry. What advice would you give this young person, or just, we can imagine any young person, or just any age person that's embarking on a journey, a creative journey? What type of advice would you give that person?
Say yes. Say yes. Say yes. Do it. If you have an opportunity, do it. That's one thing I would do. And the other thing is, don't prematurely limit yourself on what it is you do. I hear so many young people say, well, I don't really like that kind of work. I don't like that kind of series. I don't like that. And it's like, you're an artist. Your job as an artist is to not judge, and it's to sort of, experience it without prejudice and judgment. Now, as a person who's carving a career out, you can learn from that. But in your early days, say yes, do it all. You're going to learn something from every job. If it's the stupidest commercial that was ever made, and you're a raisin with a cowboy hat, you're going to learn something from that. Yeah. And you're also probably going to get resistance.
Right. There was an actor. I can't remember who it was. It was an English actor. I think Roger. Who is the guy who plays Alfred in Batman with Christian Bale?
I can't remember his name, but he's a wonderful actor. Wonderful actor.
I can't think
of it either.
I can't pop up when
Are you talking about
this.
In the television series or in the films?
No. In the films with Christian Bale.
I can't.
I'll have to pop up when I edit this. I'll be like,
I can't even picture him. Yeah.
I read his book on acting, and it was an interesting thing that it was really funny, actually. It was a really lighthearted book. And one of the points that he had was actually the same thing. He's like, a lot of other actors, he's like, for me, it was a numbers game, and I just didn't say no. I if someone offered me a role, I did it. And whatever they offered me, because he's like, I didn't know which was going to be good. There was a great interview, not interview, but Will Smith just posted something on Instagram the other day about why he turned down The Matrix, and he was like, and he talked about how horrible the Wachowski's pitch was. They had this meeting, and like it was just an absolutely like ridiculous pitch, and they were like, yeah, we got these cameras, and you're gonna be like spinning, and it's gonna be amazing. And he was just like, what? But he's like, so, and then I went and made Wild West,
something forgettable,
like, which is he's
fine.
Like, it's not bad, but he was like, obviously, if he could go back in time and have the choice.
Sure.
But he was pointing out, but one of the things he pointed out is he had no idea that Matrix was going to be this revolutionary movie.
Right.
He had no idea that Wild Wild West was going to flop.
Right, you don't.
But he made a choice, and it was for him the wrong one. But he then argued that it was a role that was meant for Keanu, which I kind of think is probably is true. But they had the same point you did. Just say yes.
Say yes. I mean, especially in your, you can get judicious and a little bit more judgmental and picky after you've worked and you've built up a body of work. But in the beginning, and also you don't know what you're going to be good at. You don't know what's going to be your niche, where casting directors and producers go, oh, I want that girl because she can do this. She looks really weird when she does that, and I like it. Or whatever. Right? So you don't know. You really don't. And
but you have to give yourself permission to go for it.
Permission to go for it.
Well, then on that note, I am going to say, I think I want to finish with say yes. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Jill.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you so much.
This morning for you, this night for me. But for all of our listeners tonight, hopefully we have lots of people watching this video. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. And for more information, I will put up information about how to reach out to Jill if you're interested in lessons, or to just say hi. And thank you again for your time tonight.
Thank you, Sean. Good night.